What Frank Lucas whispered at Bumpy Johnson's casket. The apology that took 3 years. July 10th, 1968. Abyssinian Baptist Church, Harlem. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of funeral lilies and the crushing weight of an era coming to a violent, silent end. More than 5,000 people spilled out into the streets of Harlem, from 138th Street all the way down 7th Avenue. The summer heat turned the asphalt into a mirror, reflecting the grief of an entire community saying goodbye to the only king they'd ever truly loved. You had everyone there, the high society politicians in their silk suits, wiping sweat and crocodile tears from their brows, the legendary jazz musicians who provided the heartbeat of the neighborhood, men like Duke Ellington and Count Basie, standing shoulder to shoulder with the common man, the numbers runners with their sharp suits and sharper eyes, the mothers who had their rent paid by the man in the casket, clutching handkerchiefs and photographs, and the kids who only knew him as the shield of the neighborhood, the man who made sure they had school supplies every September and Christmas toys every December. But tucked away in the very back, half hidden by a shadow and a tilted fedora, stood a man who hadn't been seen in New York for 3 years. A man most people thought was either dead or rotting in a southern ditch. A man who had once been the golden protégé, the heir apparent, before he committed the unforgivable sin and paid the price. Frank Lucas. His hands were shaking, not from fear. Frank Lucas had stopped being afraid of death the day he watched his cousin get lynched in North Carolina when he was just a boy. No, his hands were shaking because he was standing in the presence of something he had spent his entire life chasing and never quite understood until it was too late. True power, the kind that doesn't need guns or muscle or threats, the kind that lives in the hearts of 5,000 people who would walk through fire for a man who never once asked them to. To understand why the future American gangster was hiding in the back of his mentor's funeral, you have to understand the debt he owed. You have to understand that before Frank Lucas was a king, he was a student, and in 1965, he committed the ultimate sin against the man who taught him everything. He didn't just break a rule, he tried to break a kingdom. This isn't just a story about a funeral. This is a masterclass in strategy, a lesson in how a king can destroy an empire without firing a single shot, and the story of an apology that took 3 years of exile to finally whisper. Because in Harlem, respect isn't given, it's earned, and Frank Lucas learned that the hard way. The King and the Apprentice. In the early 1960s, Bumpy Johnson was the undisputed law. He was 59 years old, a lion in winter, who had survived Alcatraz, survived Dutch Schultz, and made the 5 families of the Italian mafia bow to his terms. He ruled from Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, sitting at a corner table by the window, drinking his coffee black, reading 3 newspapers a day, and keeping the peace with the precision of a chess master. Bumpy had one rule that was the foundation of his reign: no heroin in Harlem. It wasn't a business decision. It was a moral line drawn in blood and conviction. He had seen what that poison did to communities in Chicago and Philly. He saw it turn human beings into walking corpses, mothers selling their bodies for a fix, fathers abandoning their children for a needle. He saw it hollow out the souls of, turning bright-eyed teenagers into hollow-eyed ghosts, shuffling through the streets like the living dead. Bumpy had lived through the Great Depression, had seen poverty that would break most men, but he always said, "A man can survive being poor. He can't survive losing his soul." As long as Bumpy was breathing, that poison wasn't going to flow freely through his streets. But Frank Lucas, the young protégé from North Carolina, didn't see souls. He saw dollar signs. Frank had come to Harlem in 1956 at the age of 26, running from a murder charge down south. He had killed a man who had assaulted his cousin, shot him point blank in the throat, and watched him bleed out on a dirt road. When he arrived in New York with nothing but $40 and a suitcase, Bumpy Johnson saw something in him. Maybe it was the fire, maybe it was the desperation, maybe it was the fact that Frank reminded Bumpy of himself, a young man willing to die before he bowed. Bumpy took Frank under his wing. He taught him how to read the streets, how to move in silence, how to build loyalty, and most importantly, how to think 10 steps ahead. For 9 years, Frank was the perfect student. He ran numbers, collected debts, handled disputes, and never once questioned Bumpy's authority. He was family. But by 1964, Frank was 35 years old, hungry, and convinced that the old world codes of Bumpy Johnson were a cage. He looked at Bumpy and saw a relic. He looked at the Italian mafia flooding other cities with heroin and making millions, and he saw opportunity. He started asking himself a dangerous question: why should I wait for a crown when I can take one? In late 1964, Frank made his move. He traveled to Thailand, bypassing the mafia completely, and went straight to the source in the Golden Triangle. He met with Chen Li, a Chinese Thai drug lord who controlled poppy fields the size of small cities. Frank was smart. He didn't just buy product, he built a relationship. He studied the supply chain, learned the language, ate the food, respected the culture, and then he figured out the most audacious smuggling operation anyone had ever conceived. He would smuggle pure heroin back to the States in the coffins of dead soldiers coming home from Vietnam. The coffins were sacred. Nobody searched them. Nobody questioned. The bodies came home draped in the American flag, and hidden in the false bottoms and body cavities were kilos of 100% pure heroin. It was genius. It was ruthless. It was the kind of move that would make Frank Lucas a legend or a corpse. He called it blue magic. It was twice as strong as the mafia's product and half the price. It hit the streets like a tidal wave, and within 2 weeks of Frank setting up shop on 116th Street in early 1965, he was making $50,000 a week, an astronomical sum in those days. Frank thought he was the new king. He thought Bumpy was too old, too soft, and too stuck in the past to notice. He was dead wrong. The first warning. It took exactly 12 days for word to reach Bumpy. He was sitting in his usual spot at Wells' restaurant when one of his lieutenants, a man named William "Bub" Hewlett, leaned in and whispered the news. Bumpy didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He simply nodded, took another sip of his coffee, and said, "Set up a lunch, Tuesday, 2 p.m. When Frank Lucas received the invitation, his heart dropped into his stomach. He knew what it meant, but his pride wouldn't let him run. He convinced himself that Bumpy would understand, that Bumpy would see the opportunity, that maybe, just maybe, the old man would want a piece of the action. Tuesday afternoon arrived. Frank walked into Wells' restaurant, wearing a brand new Italian suit, trying to project confidence. But the moment he saw Bumpy sitting at that corner booth, calm as a Sunday morning, eating his eggs and bacon like he didn't have a care in the world, Frank knew he was walking into an execution. "Sit down, Frank," Bumpy said without looking up. Frank sat, his hands gripping the edge of the table to stop them from shaking. Bumpy took his time. He finished his eggs. He wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin. He folded the napkin neatly. And then, finally, he looked at Frank with those dark, unreadable eyes that had stared down mob bosses, crooked cops, and death itself. "I hear you've been busy, Frank," Bumpy said, his voice quiet, barely audible over the hum of the restaurant. "Just trying to make a living, Mr. Johnson," Frank replied, his voice a bit too high, a bit too defensive. Bumpy set down his fork and leaned back, studying Frank like a scientist studying a specimen. "Making a living is fine, but you're selling poison on 116th Street, my neighborhood. You know the rule." Frank felt his ego flare. He had made more money in 2 weeks than most men made in a year. He had connections in Thailand. He had a supply chain that was untouchable. And he had the streets buzzing about blue magic like it was the second coming. He wasn't going to let an old man tell him what to do. "With all respect, Mr. Johnson," Frank said, leaning forward. "That's the old way of thinking. People want it. I'm just providing a service. This is capitalism." The temperature in that booth dropped 10 degrees. The waitress who had been approaching their table turned around and walked away. The few patrons who were close enough to see Bumpy's face suddenly found reasons to look elsewhere. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Frank, I'm going to say this once, and I need you to listen carefully. This is your first warning. Take your product to the Bronx. Take it to Queens. Take it to New Jersey. I don't care. But not here. Not in my neighborhood. Not where I have to watch mothers bury their sons because of your service." Frank felt the words like a slap, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "The game has changed, Mr. Johnson. The world is different. Bumpy stood up slowly, his 6-foot frame casting a long shadow over the table. He buttoned his jacket, straightened his tie, and looked down at Frank with something close to pity. "This is your first warning. Don't make me give you a second." Frank Lucas walked out of that restaurant convinced Bumpy was finished. He thought the old man was bluffing. He thought loyalty was dead and money was king. So he did the worst thing he could have possibly done. He doubled his operation. The second warning. 2 weeks later, Bumpy called Frank back to Wells. Same table, same time. But this time there was no food, no coffee, just Bumpy Johnson sitting in the shadows, his hands folded on the table like a judge about to deliver a sentence. Frank walked in with more confidence this time. Business was booming. He had 15 street dealers working for him, 3 stash houses, and more cash than he knew what to do with. He thought Bumpy was going to negotiate, maybe ask for a cut, maybe propose a partnership. He was wrong. "I told you to stop," Bumpy said the moment Frank sat down. "And I told you this is business," Frank snapped. "You don't own Harlem, Bumpy. You can't control everything anymore. The game has changed." Bumpy leaned forward, and for the first time, Frank saw something in those eyes that made his blood run cold. It wasn't anger, it was disappointment. "Frank," Bumpy said, his voice a whisper that cut like a razor, "the only reason you're still breathing right now is because of the old rules, the same rules you're spitting on. I could have had you killed the moment you stepped off that plane from Thailand. I could have had you buried in an unmarked grave in New Jersey and nobody would have even asked where you went. But I didn't. Do you know why?" Frank didn't answer. "Because I saw something in you 9 years ago. I saw potential. I saw a man who could be great. But greatness isn't about money, Frank. It's about principle. And right now, you have none." Frank laughed, a bitter, defensive sound. "Principle doesn't pay bills, Bumpy. Principle doesn't build empires." Bumpy stood up, and this time, Frank felt the full weight of the man's presence. "You're right, Frank. Principle doesn't build empire. It builds legacies. And empires fall. They always do, especially when they're built on poison." Bumpy walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "This is your second warning. There won't be a third." Frank Lucas sat in that booth for 20 minutes after Bumpy left, staring at his reflection in the polished wood of the table. He told himself that Bumpy was old, that the world had passed him by, that money and power were all that mattered. He was about to learn the hardest lesson of his life, the 7-day takedown. Bumpy Johnson didn't believe in unnecessary violence. He had killed men before, plenty of them, but never without cause, and never without exhausting every other option first. He believed in precision, in strategy, in making moves so subtle that by the time the enemy realized what was happening, the game was already over. He knew that Frank's empire relied on 4 things: suppliers, transportation, distribution, and trust. Bumpy decided to remove all 4, not with bullets, not with fire, with intelligence. Monday, the supplier. Frank's main man in Thailand was Chen Li, a 58-year-old former Chinese military officer who controlled the poppy fields in the Golden Triangle like a warlord. Chen was ruthless, efficient, and loyal to exactly one thing: money. He had no love for Frank Lucas, no personal connection. It was purely transactional. But Chen had a weakness. His eldest son, Chen Wei, was studying chemical engineering at Columbia University in New York. The boy was brilliant, destined for greatness, but he had a gambling problem, poker mostly, high-stakes games in Chinatown that he had no business being in. By the spring of 1965, Chen Wei owed $75,000 to bookies who answered to Bumpy Johnson. On Monday morning, Bumpy made one phone call. He told his people to forgive the debt, all of it, no strings attached. Just make sure Chen Li knew that it was Bumpy Johnson who had saved his son from being found floating in the East River. When Chen Li received the message, he understood immediately. Bumpy Johnson could touch his family anytime he wanted. Bumpy Johnson had just sent a message louder than any threat: "I can protect your son, or I can destroy him." By Monday evening, Chen Li stopped taking Frank Lucas's calls. The faucet was turned off. Tuesday, the transportation. Frank was using a network of military officials and customs agents to move the coffin. These were men he had bribed, men who were making $500 a week to look the other way while coffins came through with extra weight. It was a brilliant system, until Bumpy made one call to an old friend, Special Agent Robert Frazier, had grown up on 125th Street. His mother had been a school teacher who Bumpy had helped when her husband died, making sure the family never went hungry, making sure Robert could go to college. Robert never forgot that. When he joined the FBI in 1960, he made it clear he didn't owe Bumpy anything illegal, but he'd never forget what Bumpy did for his family. On Tuesday morning, Bumpy called Robert and said 5 words. Look into Frank Lucas, quietly. By Tuesday afternoon, FBI agents were casually asking questions at military bases, at customs offices, at shipping yards. They weren't arresting anyone. They were just asking, and that was enough. Every military official and customs agent who was on Frank's payroll suddenly felt the heat. By Tuesday night, Frank couldn't get a single gram into the country. Wednesday, the distribution. Frank had 15 street dealers working for him, young men in their 20s who were making more money than their fathers ever dreamed of. They were loyal to the dollar, not to Frank. Bumpy knew that. On Wednesday morning, Bumpy's lieutenants hit the streets. They didn't threaten anyone. They didn't touch anyone. They just had conversations. Hey, you hear the feds are asking about Frank? Chen Li cut him off. The supply is gone. Frank can't protect you if he's got no product and the feds on his tail. You're a smart kid. Don't go down with a sinking ship. By Wednesday afternoon, 12 of Frank's 15 dealers had vanished. They didn't quit. They just stopped showing up. They melted back into the streets, unwilling to risk prison time for a boss who was suddenly looking very mortal. Thursday and Friday, the stash houses. Frank had 4 secret apartments all over Harlem, brownstones where he kept his cash and his product, places that only his most trusted people knew about. Bumpy didn't rob them. He didn't need to. He just made sure the right tips got to the right precincts. Building supers, landlords, janitors. These were the invisible people, the ones nobody ever paid attention to, but they all knew Bumpy. They all owed him favors. A rent payment here, a job there, a kind word when nobody else would listen. On Thursday night, an anonymous tip came into the 28th precinct. Check apartment 4C at 145 West 123rd Street. On Friday morning, another tip. There's something in the basement at 89 West 116th Street. By Friday evening, another. Look at the 3rd floor of 201 West 135th. The NYPD raided 3 of Frank's main stash houses. They seized $200,000 in cash, 12 kilos of blue magic, and enough evidence to put Frank away for 20 years. The 4th stash house, Frank cleared out himself, because by Friday night, he knew the game was over. Saturday, the message. On Saturday morning, Frank Lucas sat in his apartment with $3,000 in his pocket, a silent phone, and the crushing realization that Bumpy Johnson had dismantled his entire empire in less than a week without firing a single shot. A kid knocked on his door, maybe 12 years old, wearing a too-big coat and a nervous expression. He handed Frank an envelope and ran before Frank could ask any questions. Inside was a single piece of paper, no signature. Just 8 words written in Bumpy's unmistakable handwriting. You're still breathing. That's your only warning. Leave. Frank Lucas didn't pack. He didn't call anyone. He didn't try to negotiate. He ran. The exile Frank fled to Greensboro, North Carolina, the same town he had run from 9 years earlier. He stayed with distant cousins, people who didn't ask questions. For 3 years, he lived in the shadows, working construction jobs, keeping his head down, and thinking about Bumpy Johnson every single day. He thought about the lessons he had ignored. He thought about the rules he had broken. He thought about the look of disappointment in Bumpy's eyes when he realized his protégé had chosen greed over principle. Frank would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, replaying that final warning over and over again. You're still breathing. Voss. It wasn't mercy. It was a lesson. Bumpy could have killed him. Bumpy should have killed him by every code of the streets. But Bumpy let him live because he still believed Frank could learn. And Frank did learn. But the price of that education was 3 years of exile. 3 years of looking over his shoulder. 3 years of knowing that the only reason he was alive was because a king had shown him grace he didn't deserve. The funeral and the whisper. On July 7th, 1968, the news hit the wires. Bumpy Johnson dead at 62, heart attack at Wells Restaurant. Frank Lucas read it in a newspaper in Greensboro, and felt something break inside him. The man who had saved him, taught him, destroyed him, and spared him was gone. And Frank had never said the words that had been burning in his chest for 3 years. He drove up from North Carolina that night, arriving in Harlem just before dawn. He stood across the street from Wells' restaurant, staring at the corner booth where Bumpy used to sit, and he wept for the first time since he was a child. On July 10th, Frank stood in the back of Abyssinian Baptist Church, hidden by shadows and a tilted fedora, watching 5,000 people say goodbye to a king. He saw the politicians, the jazz legend, the street hustlers, the mothers, the children, all of them mourning a man who had given them something money couldn't buy: protection, dignity, hope. When the crowd finally thinned out and the church grew quiet, Frank walked up to the open casket. He looked at Bumpy's face, peaceful in death, free from the weight of a crown that had never once slipped. Frank knelt down, his knees hitting the cold marble floor, his eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in 3 years, he let himself feel the full weight of his shame, his regret, his grief. He leaned in close, his lips almost touching Bumpy's ear, and he whispered 7 words that had taken 3 years of exile to finally speak. "I'm sorry. You were right. I was a fool." He stayed there for a long minute, his hand resting on the edge of the casket, a ghost seeking forgiveness from a legend. And in that moment, Frank Lucas finally understood Bumpy's greatest lesson. Power isn't about what you control, it's about what you're connected to. The aftermath. Frank Lucas would go on to rebuild. With Bumpy gone, the rules changed. Frank returned to New York in 1968 and built an empire that would make him millions. He became the king of the heroin trade in the 1970s, living the life he had always dreamed of: money, power, influence. But he never forgot the 7-day lesson. He never sold near schools. He never targeted kids. He kept a code, however flawed, because the shadow of Bumpy Johnson was always watching him. And when the feds finally brought him down in 1975, when Frank Lucas, the American gangster, was sentenced to 70 years in prison, he thought about that moment at the casket. He thought about the apology that came 3 years too late. He thought about the king who had let him live so that he could learn what it meant to be a man. The final lesson. Bumpy Johnson showed the world that intelligence beats violence every single day of the week. He showed that a man's principles are worth more than $100,000 in a briefcase or $1 million in a stash house. He was a man who could face Lucky Luciano unarmed, stop a riot with a bullhorn, and destroy an empire with nothing but a phone call and a network of people who loved him. Some men are more dangerous dead than others are in their prime. Bumpy's legacy lived on through the rules he set, the families he protected, and even through the student who had to lose everything to finally learn how to be a man. Frank Lucas spent his final years out of prison, giving speeches about the cost of his choices, and every single time he would end with the same word: Bumpy Johnson was the greatest man I ever knew, and the biggest mistake I ever made was thinking I could be king without his crown. Remember, in Harlem, the crown isn't something you put on your head. It's something the people put on you because you were willing to stand in the gap when nobody else would. If this journey into the heart of Harlem's legend and the true story of Frank Lucas's apology moved you, smash that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more stories the history books are too afraid to tell. Drop a comment. Do you think Bumpy was right to let Frank live, or did mercy create a monster? Activate those notifications because we bring the truth about the streets every single week. Harlem doesn't bow. Not then, not now, not ever.